Welcome to Science and Faith. We're going to have a panel of 3 people that we've invited to come and talk about how science and faith can work together, specifically talking about creation. We are very excited that you're here, and we want this to be an evening that is beneficial for all. So we are going to be very respectful of what you guys ask, and we also just ask that you guys are respectful of what we say as well. And don't be afraid to ask questions, but we are really excited to have these conversations. Kind of the flow for tonight is going to be that each panelist is going to share for a set amount of time, about 20 minutes, on a different view of how science and faith can work together. And then there'll just be a lot of time for Q&A. So you guys will get to ask as many questions as you want, whether directly to them, or I have note cards that you can write and do it anonymously if you prefer. But without further ado, I think we are going to pray and then we'll get started. Okay? Dear Lord, I just thank you for tonight. I pray that you would give each of the speakers clear words and a clear mind. I pray that you would be working tonight and that we would know you better, and because of the words that you are putting in their mouths and the questions that you are giving us, Lord, would you help this evening to go well? In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Our first panelist is actually a member of the faculty here at EMU. Stephen Backus has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin and a postdoc from U of M. He's currently teaching in the chemistry department here at EMU. So first up, Stephen Backus. Or Backus, I'm so sorry.
All right. So thank you all again for coming. Very excited about this panel. I've done things a little bit like this before, but never quite to this audience. I've done panels where like I was the only Christian talking about the faith and science with, atheists and stuff on the panel, but I've not done one where we're hearing different views about creation and evolution, all from a Christian perspective. So I think that's really helpful. So the viewpoint that I hold that I'm going to talk about is one that's sometimes called evolutionary creationism, which, to put it in a nutshell, is the belief that God created life as we know it and all its diversity and complexity through the means of evolution. Evolution was the method that God used for creating life. This is not a complex idea. It really is just the simple combination of 2 beliefs. One is the Christian belief that God created everything, including all life. And the other is the standard sort of scientific understanding that evolution is the mechanism that led to the diversity of life. And you put those 2 together and you get evolutionary creationism. Now, behind that combination lies a root belief that is basically that science and what it can tell us about God's creation is valid. It's a reliable way. It's a method that we can use to examine creation, a method we should use even to examine creation. You won't be surprised, considering that, I've devoted my career to science, to hear that I believe that that is something that God wants us to do. I believe that, as it says in Psalms here, or Proverbs 25:2, is the glory of God to conceal things, the glory of kings to seek them out. I think that our powers of reason and of observation are part of what it means to be made in God's image, and that I believe that he intends us to use those to explore his creation and seek to understand it, and use that knowledge both to better understand and glorify him, as well as for the benefit of humankind through biotechnology and that sort of thing. So as an accessory to that, I'm beginning to get warm already, I believe that we don't have to be afraid about the search for knowledge, that will ever detract from God. If we understand God correctly, I believe that the more we learn about his creation, the greater we will realize God to be, never less. Now, I think that's fairly non-controversial, and yet the opposite viewpoint is fairly common. A viewpoint that says, really, God is there and working mostly the things we don't understand, that points to the things that don't make sense, or mysterious, as the place where God works. This idea is sometimes called the God of the gap, because the idea is that where there's a gap in our knowledge and understanding, then that's where there is space for God to work. This viewpoint is actually explicitly held by many atheists who argue that the whole reason we have an idea of God is because primitive peoples, there were many things in the natural world they didn't understand, and so they came up with God as sort of an explanation. They saw the lightning, and it was, amazing and mysterious, and so they thought there was a God of the lightning. Or they saw an earthquake, and it was impressive and scary, so they came up with a God of an earthquake. But then this line of argument goes, now that we have science to explain these things, we don't need God anymore. Now, obviously, I don't subscribe to that argument. Instead, I believe, as Christianity teaches, that God is the God of everything, that he is at work in every moment of every event, in every molecule, in all of creation, like constantly at work. All of that is in his hands. And that's things we understand and the things we don't. And that's, I think, the widely accepted Christian viewpoint, and with clear biblical support to that idea that God is in and controlling everything. And yet, I feel that a God of the gap sort of argument does slip in among Christians often, probably unintentionally, when they like to focus on or emphasize gaps in knowledge or things that science can't explain as evidence for God working. But the thing is that if something we don't understand, if that's evidence that God did it, well, then it kind of implies that if we do understand it, then maybe God didn't do it. And that's not, I think, a good conclusion to make, because then the more we understand, the smaller and smaller God gets. So I really want to declare, in contrary to that God is at work in everything, whether we understand it or not. Our understanding of it in a scientific means has no bearing on whether or not God was in control. So our God is the God of the lightning, even if we understand electricity. And our God is the God of the earthquake and the volcano, even if we understand plate tectonics. And our God is the God who created all life in its diversity and complexity, even if we understand evolution. That doesn't affect those things. So that's my first point. Now I want to move on and talk a little bit, in the time I have left, about evolution so that we can understand it a little better, because I think it is not widely understood. And evolution really, as I understand, has two halves, and I want to talk about them separately. One half that's called common descent, and one half that's called natural selection. So I'll start with common descent. So common descent is the fancy term for the idea that all life is related, that it's what lies behind these sort of evolutionary family trees that you've often seen, where all the different organisms are different branches, and they're all connected together because the belief is that they are all related, as a family is related, genetically related, had a common ancestor. Now, this at first glance seems kind of surprising, maybe a little crazy, because I don't look much like an oak tree. How are we related? But where this came from is that hundreds of years ago, as scientists began looking more carefully at life, they realized that even things that looked pretty different, like me and an oak tree, when they looked closer, they had really surprising similarities. Like, we're both made of cells, for example. Or another famous example you've probably heard of, because it was very influential at the time, was the study of comparative bone morphology. So that, the hand, the arm of a human and the wing of a bat and the flipper of a porpoise, all these are very different structures that have different purposes. But if you look inside at the actual bones, they have largely the same bones. Now, they're longer or shorter, they've changed, they've been modified, but it's the same underlying structure. And why would that be for these differently purposed things if there wasn't some sort of connection there? And moreover, not only were there these similarities, but there were patterns of similarities where organisms that were more similar in one way were also more similar in another way, and ones that were more distant in one way were also more distant in another way. And they were able to, by that, organize things into families. And so the idea they came up with was the easiest explanation for all this similarity that we see in these patterns of similarities are if life is actually related, so that the bat and the porpoise, for example, had a common ancestor and then diversified to their particular forms as necessary. So at the time, this was a radical suggestion, and it was controversial. That is no longer true. This has been sort of reaffirmed and confirmed so many times by newer scientific discoveries that it's no longer a matter of debate. So, for example, biochemistry. I myself am a biochemist, so that is to say, I study the chemical reactions that occur within life and how those are controlled by our cells, by our enzymes. That is a field that's not known at all when the theory of evolution first came up. But once they discovered and were able to study biochemistry, they found that at a biochemical level, life is much more similar than it even was at like a bone structure level. That in fact, very divergent things like bacteria and blue whales have very similar biochemistry. As one example, one of the biochemical pathways, and don't worry about the details, I just put it there and impress you, but one of the pathways that I teach to my 400 level biochemistry class is called glycolysis. This is a pathway, something that's happening in your cells right now. It's how you break down sugar to produce energy from it. And when I teach my students glycolysis and all the reactions and the enzymes and how they all work, I don't bother to tell them whether I'm talking about glycolysis in a human or glycolysis in a bacteria, because there is no difference. It's the same process. I'm sure there are actually some small subtle differences, but they are so subtle that I would not bring them up in an undergraduate class. Like they're beyond that level of subtlety. All of the essentials are the same through this great diversity of life. But the real clincher for the relatedness of all life isn't biochemistry, it's actually genetics. So DNA sequences. DNA, again, was unknown at the time of Darwin. This is not what they based the theory on, but it was later confirmation, because we now know that DNA sequences are what code for basically everything that goes on in the cell. And we have the sequences for the genes, all the genes of probably thousands of organisms, hundreds at least, I think thousands of different organisms. And so we can compare them and line them up and see which are more similar and which are distant. And what they found when they did this was that the patterns of DNA similarity followed the same relatedness patterns that had already been established by other methods. Again, there were a few variations, particularly down with the single-celled organisms. The microbes do some funny things with lateral gene transfer that messes up the family tree. But largely it recapitulated. So I made an example here, a simple example that hopefully you can see. I took a particular gene from yeast, mouse, and chicken, and I aligned that gene, and it's color-coded here. So the dark purple is where all those three are exactly the same. And the light purple is where 2 out of the 3 are the same, but the third one in white is different. And what I think you can see just from a glance is that the mouse and the chicken genes are very similar. They're almost exactly the same. There's a few differences, but they're very similar throughout the length. Whereas the yeast gene, it has some similarity, but also more differences, which is what would be predicted by the fact that, mice and chicken are both animals and, multicellular animals at that, and yeast is a fungus, so it's more divergent. And yet there's still some similarity between them. And this is a simplistic example, but people have done this sort of things with hundreds of genes from thousands of organisms, and it lines up. It supports that. So because of this sort of all of this evidence, like I said, there really is no debate among biologists about the relatedness of life. In fact, it's a foundational concept within biology. It's something that I rely on every day when I'm doing my research. I don't think I really could do biochemistry research without believing in the relatedness of life. I think it'd be like trying to be a rocket scientist without believing the earth is round. It just wouldn't work. And it does work. And we know that it works. And it's not just some weird groupthink that biologists have, because of the biotechnology that that line of inquiry has led to. So one example here, insulin. Probably heard of insulin. It's a human protein produced from a human gene that acts as a hormone in our body that regulates sugar. We can and have taken that human gene, put it in bacteria, E. coli, and that bacteria knows how to make the human protein from the human gene, and it can do it right. There are a couple of final processing steps that it doesn't know how to do because, it doesn't have the machinery for those, but the basics of the protein is correct. And then we can take that protein that the bacteria have made for us, that human protein, out of the bacteria, give it the last couple of processing steps, and then inject it into diabetic patients to treat their disease. And this is routinely done. This is one of the major sources of insulin that is used to treat diabetes. And I think the only reason the bacteria knows how to do that is because it's related to the humans and it uses a lot of the same machinery. And certainly we wouldn't have thought to have done this if not for our understanding of the relatedness of life. Okay, so that's common descent. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is natural selection, which is the other half of the theory of evolution and answers kind of the opposite question. So essentially, the question that common descent was trying to answer is, why is it that all these different organisms, when you look close enough, are really strikingly similar? And the answer is because they're actually related. But that raises the opposite question, which is, well, if all life is related, then how is it they got to be so different? Because, let's face it, a bacteria and a blue whale, even if biochemically they're pretty similar, in many other ways they are not. There are many differences there. So how do we get to that variety of life? And the explanation that is given in the theory of evolution is of natural selection. So how does that work? It's a multi-step process. It begins with the idea that individuals have differences, right? So, some finches' beaks are a little bigger or a little smaller. There's just variation within a population. Many of these differences get passed on because of the way that genetics and inheritance works. So bigger finches will tend to have baby finches with bigger beaks. And some of these differences matter. Sometimes in certain situations, having a bigger or smaller beak helps you survive. And in that case, you're going to pass that on to your children. And that is the whole idea of natural selection, is that the differences that help you survive are passed on. And then the last idea is that over vast periods of time, millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, these very small incremental changes can add up to large, very dramatic changes in form, like between the fox and the pine tree. So the question this begs, of course, is natural selection really enough? So understanding, larger or smaller beaks of a finch, that's not too hard. People don't generally have an issue with that. The question is, well, can you take lots of little incremental changes and go from a bacteria to a blue whale? Can it explain such huge changes? Can it explain the complexity that we see in life? And my answer to that is going to be yes, but. So yes, natural selection is a feasible mechanism that could have created all that complexity that is generally understood. But it is unclear how likely that really is, that we could have created such complexity through just these incremental natural selection changes. So my own sense, when I look at the complexity of life, and I'll tell you, as a biochemist, I have more of an appreciation for that complexity than probably even most of you do, because down at a subcellular level, that complexity there, I think, outshines anything that you can see with your naked eye. The chemical complexity is amazing. And I think it's very unlikely that natural selection would have or could have created that complexity. Unless, of course, there just happened to be a God who was guiding this process with a purpose in mind. And if that was the case, which of course is what I believe is the case, because I believe that God is the creator and the designer of everything, then I don't think it's hard to believe at all. Then, I have no problem believing that God could have used that process of evolution for this. Now, I do want to be clear, make a couple caveats here. So one is, I am not saying that I think the theory of evolution is flawed or invalid scientifically. It's a long-standing, it's well-supported theory, it's well accepted, it's the best theory we have, certainly, to accept these things. Secondly, scientists actually disagree on how unlikely it is. So I said, I think it's pretty unlikely that it could, right? That's my impression. That is also other scientists' impression. There are scientists for sure who say it seems really unlikely this could have happened. And some of them are bothered by that, some aren't. Some say, well, yeah, unlikely things happen sometimes. Sure, it's unlikely that natural selection could have led to this, but it's a happy accident. It happens. Other scientists disagree. That is unlikely. And they say that my impression that is unlikely is because I don't really have a grasp of how long of a time we're talking about. And we are talking about billions of years, a few billion years at least. And that is a long time. So maybe if you give it that much time, then it doesn't seem that unlikely. It still seems unlikely to me. But this is a question that isn't resolved by science. It's not fundamentally impossible for science to resolve, but we don't have a handle on it. So all we really have is our subjective impressions of it and minus different factors. Finally, I want to be careful not to institute or reset up a God of the gap argument. I'm not saying that because it seems unlikely that evolution could have done this without guiding it, then therefore God must have guided it. Whether or not evolution is likely or unlikely, right or wrong, has nothing to do with my belief in God as the creator. That belief in God comes from my experience with him and that of other Christians and the testimony of scripture and that sort of thing. I would not rest my faith in God in anything as flimsy as an apparent gap in our scientific understanding. Because what if tomorrow somebody came up with a new theory that seemed to explain things a lot better and, made it really obvious? That wouldn't change my faith in God. All I'm trying to say is that I think evolution and creation can really go hand in hand, that it's very easy to believe in God as the creator and evolution as the means of creation. I think they fit together well. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next panelist is Dr. Jim Bull. He is a graduate of U of M and Wayne State Medical School. He works as the Chief Medical Officer for Angela Hospice in Livonia, and he has actually participated in many talks in faith and science.
Go. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Stephen. Excellent presentation. Actually, I hope I'm different enough from you to be a different point of view, but I think I have a different view. So as I said, my name is Jim Bull. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. Excited to be here. Excited to be able to present. It's been about 15 years since I presented, at least in a college format. I am currently a physician. Previously, when I was at University of Michigan, my training was in cellular and molecular biology, and I had time to work in genetics, particularly on the Human Genome Project, before I was able to go into med school. And of course, I knew about evolution, before I came to college, and I went to church before I came to college. But I didn't really realize that there was this sort of tension between the two until I got to college, and people's opinions became stronger as we enter that late teen, early 20 phase. But I did want to point out that historically speaking, that's sort of a new phenomenon when it comes to science and faith. Historically, most scientists were Christians until perhaps the mid-1800s at the earliest. And that was based on an understanding of Scripture, understanding of the Bible, that God created it. As Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." So the people wanted to research the creation. They wanted to do science because, one, God did it, but it also told us something about God, something that the Bible would share to us, but also the world does as well. And the idea was that there was sort of this two-book philosophy. You have the Bible on one hand and you have creation on the other, and both are testaments to God himself. Now, if you were to take a biology class 200 years ago, you wouldn't have heard of Charles Darwin because he was pretty young at that point. But you probably would have been given a book called Natural Theology by a person by the name of William Paley. And this was back in 1802, and it was the predominant scientific view. And he created what is best known as the watchmaker argument. And it goes, I'll simplify it here, but he says if he's walking across a field and he sees a rock on the ground, he doesn't know whether that rock's been there forever or not. There's no way to tell. But if he's walking across a field and he sees a watch and picks it up and looks at it and sees that it has a purpose, it tells time, it harmonizes with the time of the day, and it has very intricate gears built into it, he would say, well, this level of complexity demands that someone was a designer. And there's a common sense approach to creation that if you look at it, you see that it's different from things that just happen. Life seems to be designed for a purpose. And he has a 500-page book that goes through human physiology, animal physiology, plant physiology, and shows purpose and design, in his view, in all creatures that he was able to describe. However, this view became overturned after Charles Darwin wrote his book, Origin of Species. Now, Charles Darwin, as a young man, actually read William Paley, and he was convinced by the theological arguments put in there. However, after his trip to the Galapagos on the voyage of the Beagle, famous historic trip, he observed changes in the different creatures on the Galapagos Islands, variations, and started to develop his theory of evolution. Probably the simplest thing that he would say is that, well, if a living creature has a child or a person has a child, it looks kind of like the parent, but not exactly. There's some variation. There's a difference between parent and child. And these variations can be actually used in a certain way. You look at dog breeders, he looked more at pigeon breeders of all things, but he would see that, you can breed animals to be very different, such as the difference between a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. So by intentionally, this would be artificial intelligence selection, you can create great diversity in life over just a few generations. But he hypothesized that even without an intelligent guide, natural forces would also select traits that would favor survival. So animals in different parts of the world or different areas of a country would develop slightly differently depending on the environmental pressures that were placed on him. And he called this evolution by natural selection, which, as Stephen rightly said, is the main paradigm, is the primary, only paradigm to explain how life came to be in the modern science academia. Charles Darwin, this was controversial at the time. Charles Darwin decided to add insult to the injury by writing Descent of Man a few years later, where he said, well, not only is all life evolved from other creatures, your grandmother was an ape, and humans are descended from primates along the way too. And I want to take just a quick moment here to make some specific definitions of creation evolution for the purpose of my talk. These words are used in different forms, but the way I'm going to try to use them tonight, and hopefully I won't slip up myself, is that creation describes the act of an intelligent being working to make something. In this case, we're going to presume that intelligent being is God, the God of the Bible, works for most of the monotheistic religions, if you want to spread it out. And evolution is different. Evolution is something that happens naturally without the input of a creator. No criticism on Stephen, but to just say, to separate the two out as terms. So I will define myself for the purposes of this talk as an old earth creationist. Well, what do I mean by that? I say that God has been active in the creation of our world and of all living creatures. I want to say that the earth and the universe are also billions of years old. I'm not going to challenge the geology department here or the astrophysics department for the purpose of this talk. I also will say that evolution is real. It happens. It works. We all lived through it during the COVID pandemic. I being on the front lines of that in the hospital in Livonia, where we had a horrible case of COVID when it first happened. People were dying left and right. However, during the next 4 or 5 years since then, COVID has actually changed from a very lethal virus to actually a fairly mild one. That generally doesn't kill people. It still can, but certainly not with the ferocity it was doing in March of 2020. But I also want to add that evolution is an insufficient mechanism to have created life by itself. And I think I might have found an example. I am a little rusty on this. It's been a while since I've given these talks, so I'm certainly willing to take any criticism or correction as we go through the talk. Look, when I was coming to this understanding of how science and faith works, I was in college, as I mentioned, and I had the privilege while there of working in the genetic labs at University of Michigan for a researcher and physician by the name of Dr. Francis Collin, the gentleman on the right there with the glasses. He, for full disclosure, is a theistic evolutionist. He believes evolution is sufficient to make all of mankind. But while I was in that lab, I was working with him, and he would give a lot of talks on science and faith as well. He was very open about his faith. liked to talk about it, liked to engage the students, and was pretty good at it overall. He went on to become the head of the Human Genome Project in Bethesda, Maryland. Later on, went on to become the head of the whole NIH, and just retired a few years ago. But he has done well for himself in life. But the person of interest is actually the guy standing next to him, which is another gentleman by the name of J. Craig Venter. Francis Collins was put in charge of the national project for the human genome, which was to decipher the entire genetic code for human beings. And a lot of money was poured into it by the government. He was in charge of all the different research labs across the country. But Craig Venter said, I'm going to do it by myself. And he created a private company and started to steamroll his way right through that genome. And he was busting his butt. And actually, you could argue he probably won. I hate to say it because I like Francis so much, but he went along and he basically got there kind of first. They were both given credit at the same time. I'm sure Craig Venter paid the Time illustrator to put him slightly in front of Francis, kind of eclipsing him there. But nonetheless, the two of them got there. Now, unlike Dr. Collins, Dr. Venter is very much he's a corporate man. He likes science for the purpose of making money. And after he raced Dr. Collins to the end of the human genome, he started on other projects as well. And the one that he started next was the concept to create the simplest living organism ever. Now, how would he do such a thing? Well, I got to give a little bit of quick science history. What in the world makes something alive to begin with? How are you going to know if it's the simplest one if it's alive? Well, some of these questions are hard to answer the more you look into them, but I think a general consensus would be it's something that can reproduce, whether it's a fungus, whether it's a tree, whether it's a bacterium, whether it's a person, is able to reproduce. Not only is it able to reproduce, but it's able to organize itself into a form that makes it healthy and stable enough to keep reproducing. It metabolizes, it eats, it's able to take nutrients into itself in order to sustain itself, and is able to maintain itself for a certain amount of time. It doesn't just take food in and then reproduce and die. It's something that actually lives and thrives for a while. And most living things are composed, actually all living things are composed of nucleic acids, such as DNA, RNA, and proteins. And most of them are also composed of fats and sugars. But for the purposes of talk, we're going to focus on those other three. For those who are not familiar, DNA is an abbreviation, an acronym for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a double-stranded helical molecule made up of nucleotides that contain all the information to make an organism. Everybody has a slightly different DNA. That DNA is your blueprint for yourself. Every living creature has DNA that allows it to be a blueprint. RNA is a similar molecule, ribonucleic acid. It's a single-stranded molecule. It's similar to DNA that acts as an intermediate between DNA and protein formation. And finally, a protein is what is coded for in DNA for the most part. And it's a string of amino acids, which are small molecules that make up proteins, that form big molecules called proteins, which perform most of the work of being. What is a gene? A gene is a length of DNA that contains the code to produce a protein. Some of the more common proteins out there are hemoglobin, which carries oxygen around our body so that we can live. Collagen, it supports our body, it's our hair, it's our toenails. Insulin is a hormone that's created that helps ferry sugar into the cell from the bloodstream. And then for those of you who get asked what type of protein do you want on your burrito tonight, and you pick the non-vegetarian option, you're eating actin and myosin, which are the proteins that make up muscles. And there are many other proteins in the body as well. But anything that is doing a purpose for the most part in the body is usually considered a protein. And every gene is made up of a code of 4 different nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. And these bond together in what are called base pairs. A sticks to T, G sticks to C, and you usually see it printed out as a string of those 4 letters in one way or another. I get all that just to give you a little bit of background of what Dr. Venner was doing. So he had a project called the simplest minimal cell. And what he did was he started with the simplest creature he could find, and that was Mycoplasma mycoides, tiny little bacteria that lives in the colons of cows and goats. And it seems to do just fine with a little 525 genes. For comparison, the human being has over 20,000 genes, and these people, and not to say that number of genes makes you better or more complex, but in general, the less you have, the simpler you are. Now, Mycoplasma mycoides with 525 genes, what he did then was he figured out the whole, just like you do with the human genome, like what is the whole code for the mycoplasma? I want to know the whole string. And then he created a slightly synthetic chromosome out of it. We can actually print DNA now. We have machines that just A, C, T, G, T, G, C, and you can make your own string of DNA. So he figured out what mycoplasma was. He had his printer printed out, took a totally different bacteria, destroyed the DNA in that, took his printed DNA, stuck it in the new bacterial cell, and guess what? He created this chromosome, stuck it inside, and the new bacterium was able to reproduce and became Mycoplasma mycoides itself. So it kept growing and dividing. It was thriving. It basically brought it back to life, Frankenstein style, stuck a new brain in it, and it went ahead and grew and lived. But now he had the entire blueprint for mycoplasma. He said, well, how many of these genes do we really need for something to live? And so what he did was, this was what he called his creation, which was basically the same thing, JCV1 Synth 1.0, John Craig Venter Institute Synthetic 1.0, version 1.0. It's not romantic at all. It's fairly dull. But what he did was he said, well, let me just knock out one gene. I'm going to knock out one gene. I'm going to reprint it without that one gene in it and see if it lives. So he did. He reprinted the gene DNA after removing one gene, and he did it again. Inserted the shortened DNA strand into an empty bacterial shell. And if it lives, great. You don't really need that gene. Might be doing something, but it's not essential for life. Repeat it again. Kept doing it, knocking one gene out after another. Took him about 10 years to go through the whole process. He only actually got it down to 473 genes. Cut the number of actual base pairs down by almost half, but the number of genes was still 473 that were left. And he actually had to this was a very weak and pampered bacteria. It was sitting in a pool of nutrients. It'd be like lying on the ground, mouth wide open, having a Vegas buffet pouring into your face, babies coming out the other side. And this is what the bacteria was doing the whole time. It had no effort. It didn't have to hunt for food. It didn't have to look around. It was just thriving, and it wasn't so good. So they actually put 19 genes back in to make it a little more stable, bringing it up to 492. Now, Dr. Venner was doing this once again because he's a businessman. He was making a tool. He wasn't doing it for any great philosophical or even scientific reason. He was probably proud to say, hey, I'm the first guy that synthesized the genome. I'm the first guy that found the simplest minimal cell. But then he wants that thing to be a tool. He wants to use it to make other proteins like insulin, like we were seeing earlier, or to chew up oil spills. That was his goal for it. But I was kind of like, you know what? This is actually kind of interesting from a philosophical point of view, because you had to go through all these genes one at a time to determine if they're essential. And without all 473 of these genes working together, that organism would die. There wasn't any, it's like, okay, you got it down to the weakest, feeblest thing, and then it dies. So this appears to determine what would be a minimal level of complexity from where evolution itself could start. There was nothing else you could cut out of it and say, okay, this is a simpler. And for evolution to be true, at least all the way to the bottom, you've got to have a gradual step-by-step process. But here we're stuck with actually a pretty complex 473. That's 1/40th of roughly the number of genes that we have. And 50% of these genes, as was shown earlier, are what are called highly conserved. These genes are pretty much the same in bacteria, in fungus, in corn, in human beings, because they're very essential and there's no other way to do it. if you look at a parrot, it has a beak. If you look at a squid, it has a beak. But those beaks are very different. The parrot beak is made out of bone and cartilage, where the squid beak is made out of something called chitin. They are made from completely different genes for completely different ways. They just kind of both look the same when you look at them side by side. So there's two radically different pathways to make an animal beak if you want to. But there aren't two different ways to make DNA or different ways to synthesize protein. These are the genes that are the same. And why is that important? Is because you can't say, okay, he has the simplest genome, but maybe there was another way out there to make DNA that faded away or died out. Well, if it doesn't seem like it because it's not preserved anywhere else. Over half of these genes are the same in all creatures. And the Institute even, it was 2016 they made this thing. 10 years later, they haven't even figured out what all of those genes do. I think they're down to like 17% unknown at this point. Now, looking at it from the other side is, okay, we can't get any lower than this. Is there any way to build up from the bottom? How do we create life starting from nothing? Well, if anyone's taken biology lately, you probably heard about the Miller-Urey experiment back from 1952. It's basically a couple of gentlemen guessing what the early Earth would look like. They thought the atmosphere was probably made of methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen. They put them in a glass tube together, sent some electric sparks through it, and after a few rounds, little red sludge formed in the bottom. Looking at that sludge, they were able to isolate certain chemicals, including amino acids, glycine, alanine, and aspartic acid, molecules which were used to make proteins in living creatures. They and others since then have tried other gases. Maybe the early atmosphere looked a little different. Maybe there was other things in there, more nitrogen. And so they would add a different gas, and they could come out with different types of organic molecules, different amino acids, and even some of the nucleotides that make up RNA and DNA. And RNA is often thought of nowadays as if there's a naturalistic way, if there's a way that life could have started without a creator, it's got to be through RNA. RNA, like DNA, can store genetic information. Certain RNA strands also behave like proteins. They're enzymes. They'll catalyze reactions, move life forward. One lady by the name of Tracy Linkman, by taking some RNA and manipulating the genes a little bit, actually got the RNA to copy itself like something that might live and keep procreating. And this was found about 10 years ago. So this was hopeful. People are saying, well, maybe at the beginning there was an RNA world. You have these little pools of water besides volcanoes or geysers that allow for chemical reactions to form complex molecules. RNA would form in that. It would get covered in some soapy things that look a lot like a cell membrane, and they could keep reproducing, and this would be the beginning of life. Now, it's a kind of a fun idea, fantasy idea, but it never really has gone anywhere. In fact, the best article I found on this, the RNA world hypothesis, the worst theory of early evolution on life, except for all the others. And there are many other ideas. Some people thought protein started first. Some people thought life started by hydrothermal vents in the oceans. There's the idea of panspermia, which is life coming from outer space on comets and meteorites, and it's sort of spread all around the world. But I think the biggest problem with the RNA world hypothesis is this sort of primitive protocell with RNA replicating and thriving inside a soap bubble. No one's ever got that to go anywhere. It's not something that has been made, has been created, nor has been found. We do have things in the world, which is RNA covered with a lipid membrane. It's called a viroid, which is a brother or cousin to a virus. But all that is a parasite that needs another living creature to live. It needs to latch on to usually a plant to thrive, replicate, and without a host, it falls apart with time. It can't survive. So this leads us to what Stephen said we don't ever want to get to, is a gap. Right. A gap between, well, maybe let's give full credit to the RNA world. Maybe we can get RNA soap bubbles going. But we still have this huge gap between that and the simplest life form that could even Dr. Venter could come up with. what do we do with this gap? Well, usually it's based on your philosophical presupposition. If you say there's a God out there, well, God's probably working in that gap. And I would agree that God is working in the things we know as well as the things we don't know. So yeah, I'd say he is. But if you don't believe in God, then you say, well, natural selection somehow has to fill the hole of that gap. And God of the gaps theory is a rightly criticized thing. You can't just say, well, I don't know how it happened, so God must have done it. That is an argument from ignorance. And also, better than that, it sort of lacks a mechanism. It's like, how he's saying God did it, but what does that mean? How is God doing that? But on the flip side, this is a little bit of a different thing because we do have a scientific experiment, Venter's simplest living organism, that tested and tested and tested and tested again to see, can we get something simpler than his little creation? And the answer was no. That's as simple as it gets. And so the data from the simplest minimal project demonstrates what I would consider an evolutionary bottom for life on Earth. It can't evolve from below that. It's been shown. This gets into a phrase first coined by a doctor named Michael Behe, PhD, who said there's something called irreducible complexity. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. I think there's some problems in Behe's examples that he uses, but the concept is solid. If you can find something that is too complex to have gradually evolved, then you can't say it was done by natural selection. That's just a logical consistency. So the no God of the gaps means is like, well, but there's no God, so there must have been some way that it happened without a creator. This is sort of philosophical begging on the other side. Now, the one thing, though, that in all these projects that science has shown is that both all the early molecules of life up to life itself can definitely be created. These scientists have created the molecules that make proteins, the molecules that make RNA, the RNA that reproduces itself, and the simplest living organism have been made. Which makes me say, perhaps we've actually found our mechanism after all. You can either argue that we don't know what's going on here. We floundered for over 30 years trying to figure out how life could start from nothing. But we've also shown how life can be made if an intelligent creator is involved. Now, since Dr. Venter and the other scientists were not around at the beginning of life, we'll have to assume it was a different creator than the modern faculty at EMU or other colleges. I'm going to argue that creator is God. There are other options out there, of course, but I think this is a logical way to say, here is a gap that only a creator can fill, and it is the most logical, consistent mechanism, as we have already shown. So what's my summary? One, the creation of the John Craig Venter Institute Synthetic 3.0 has been demonstrated that an organism without a minimum of 473 genes cannot survive. Non-living collections of molecules, otherwise known as dead organisms, cannot reproduce and therefore cannot evolve in Darwinian manner. Anything with less than 473 genes dies. Currently, the only mechanism shown to be able to create this level of complexity are intelligent beings. Therefore, when the first living cell came into existence, the available evidence suggests that it would need to have been created. And if we see that the creator is acting at that one spot, there's no reason not to search for other spots where the creator would have worked to make life as well. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Our third panelist is Cindy Hayes. She has worked in both the medical engineering field and as a physical therapist. She's also part of an organization called Search for the Truth Ministries. Yes, so you can click that on.
Yeah. Your Just a second here. So make sure it's clicking. Is it clicking? Is it not clicking? Oh, and
It just was. Sure.
there we go.
There we go. Okay, so can I ask everyone just to stand up for a moment? I think we've been sitting for a little while. I'm a physical therapist and used to getting people moving. You can go ahead and just have a seat if you would. Appreciate it. Just want to get a little bit of circulation going. So I like to start all of my talks with "The King is alive and his word is truth." With tonight's topic specifically being on faith and science. And as the previous two speakers have mentioned, it can be somewhat of a touchy subject in today's world, in today's culture. So when you think about faith and science, a lot of people do think you either have to pick the Bible or science, one or the other, that they're kind of like fire and water, that they're opposites, they can't be blended together. Or maybe they can go hand in hand. And that's more my perspective. So just to summarize, my viewpoint is going to be different than the previous two speakers, but I do believe that the Bible is accurate in science and history. That creation did occur in 6 24-hour days. And that what we observe is that plants and animals do reproduce after their own kinds. And that's another word for a species. And this, as stated in the book of Genesis, living creatures according to their kinds. God actually stated that 10 times in the first chapter of Genesis in talking about how things reproduce. And then I also believe that humans were created in God's image, that we did not evolve from a lower form of life or any type of ape-like creature. And then the last one is that Noah's flood was a worldwide historic event. And again, the main question at the heart of the matter is did man evolve from an ape-like creature? And I'll be honest, for 50 years of my life, thought that this theory was plausible until in the last 5-6 years, I've started to ask the animals and they will teach you. And what I mean by that is I've gotten involved in a ministry that looks at the details of what God has created and some of their abilities and the features that they have and how these could not have come about by random mutations and natural selection. One of the resources is this devotional, and it basically just provides scientific evidence for God in the world around us by looking at different topics of science, and anywhere from biology, geology, physics, astronomy, and all different areas, anatomy. And again, it points out details about what God has created and how these life forms could not have evolved by random chance mutations. And so my son and I, Jimmy is with me tonight, he's a Special Olympics athlete, and the Eagle page became one of our favorite pages. So since you guys, your mascot is Swoop, I had to just throw this in here. He was an Eagle in 2019, the year that we read this book together and started getting more passionate about it. I just honestly am in awe and amazement of the creatures that God has placed on this earth. And this is an Atlas moth. It's from Southeast Asia. And if you'll notice, there's the image of a snake on each of its wings. And it just so happens that the bird predators are afraid of this type of snake. So when you think about genetics and our DNA code and these types of things, I think you find yourself scratching your head. How would natural selection or random mutations in the first place make this beautiful pattern with the snake picture that has a function of scaring away its predators. Oops. Back to swoop. Heading in the right direction here. Okay. So again, when at the time of Darwin, their technology was nowhere near what we have today, and a cell just was basically made up of a cell membrane with a nucleus, cytoplasm, and they could see little organelles in there. And evolution seemed, I would call it, plausible. I'm not sure why this is black. Oh, okay. But with today's technology, we know the cells are very complex. They're made up of thousands of parts, and each of these parts have a very specific function, and the inner workings of a cell is equivalent to a manufacturing facility with all these different operations going on simultaneously and connecting and communicating with each other. And the other point about even just a single-celled organism is that none of these parts that we find within a cell are found to occur naturally outside of living organisms. So I'm thinking back to the origin of life, like how did that first cell form? How did parts come together when these parts are only made within a fully functioning cell? So, and again, we don't find them occurring naturally outside of a cell. So I want to look in a little more detail at this particular component here. This tail is called a flagellum, and we're just going to take a look at what this part looks like. And it turns out it's the equivalent of a microscopic electric motor. Okay, so here's just part of the whip-like tail. And I want to show you guys a video of what these motors look like on the back of a bacteria. So there are 7, this particular bacteria has 7 whip-like tails. These purple gears are perfectly designed, and the green 7 outer gears are what are turning it all in unison, working together. These whip-like tails are being spun at 100,000 RPM. The motor can change direction on a quarter turn and then spin 100,000 RPM in the other direction. And obviously it's acting as a propeller, moving this bacterium through the medium that it lives in so it can find its food sources. So it's essential for the bacteria to survive. So when we take a look at the components of this motor, again, it just completely resembles my days in engineering, what a schematic or drawing of an electric motor would look like. It's got the U-joint, a stator, rotor, and just all the components that you would find in an electric motor, drive shaft, bushings, bearings, and it has a total of 40 parts. And each of these parts is very specifically designed and precisely made. And the motor itself, if even one of those parts is missing, the motor will not function. So when you think again about evolutionary processes and gradual changes, or how this could have possibly come together one small random mutation at a time, it doesn't make sense, because the motor will not function unless every part is in the perfect place and perfectly formed. So again, could random changes make this motor? That's the question. The bacteria needs it to survive. So it's not something that could be developed over millions of years. So what actually makes the parts? Inside the nucleus of every cell, where our DNA is contained, our genetic material. We have the chromosomes that are made up of strands of DNA, and the DNA is responsible for making not only the parts within our body, but also the coding for the controlling the processes. And when DNA was originally discovered, they thought it was just specifically only for making the parts. And they thought the remaining 90% was junk DNA, like leftover evolutionary mistakes. But then as science has moved on, they've figured out that no, that's actually all been useful information used for coding the processes of our body. So this is just a schematic of what an individual protein, an example of what one would look like. They're kind of fun. It looks like confetti, so to speak. It looks like someone just had a party. But anyway, I'm just pointing out how we don't think of the Bible as having statements of science, but they're in there when you look at them from the right perspective. Here's how God worded it. You knit me together in my mother's womb as if embroidered with various colors. So this picture, to me, that's a pretty good description exactly of what's going on at the level of the proteins in our bodies.
You need to listen very carefully to it.
So I'm going to play a short video from a genetic researcher who he was an atheist and spent years trying to prove the theory of evolution through the area of genetics. And what happened is the further he dug into his research, he was actually turned around 180 degrees. And we're going to hear part of this video.
I'd like you to listen very carefully to an expert in the field who will explain what science really shows us about where human beings have come from, where the abilities and the inventiveness of humanity has truly originated.
4 powerful arguments that actually disprove evolution have come to light in the last decades. And that's like, these arguments are incredibly strong. First one is programming in play. So I'd like to read a quote here from Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about computers, right? And so he says this: the understanding of life is a great subject. Biological information is the most important information we can discover because over the next several decades, it will revolutionize medicine. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. In other words, the information system, just the information system within the DNA, is more sophisticated than our best computer scientists can program, way beyond what they could ever accomplish. Oftentimes, when people try to teach the idea of ape to man evolution, they use like an illustration, and so you just reshape a chimp into a human. But you see, what makes a human is the information. The human who has the genetic information necessary for doing calculus and sending men to the moon and doing art. They're programmed to be humans and to have human bodies, and that information is in the DNA. And chimpanzees are programmed to be chimpanzees and to behave like chimpanzees. They're really good at climbing trees, and they're really good at peeling bananas, for example. So this programming, it requires reprogramming. Now, one thing that computer scientists really, really understand really, really clearly is that programs don't arise by themselves. And you can't just trial and error try to improve a program. Well, let's just change a bit here and a bit there and a byte there. And maybe it'll morph into a totally new functional program. That's not how computer science works. And that's not how any information system works. Information is the product of intelligence. And so the information within a cell is staggering. I can't adequately explain it, except to say that the DNA is just the first level of the information. Here's a concept that I think everyone can grasp, is everything in the cell is talking to everything else. So there's crosstalk within all the components of a cell and between all the cells of the body. There's crosstalk continuously. It's similar to an internet system within a cell. And then we have 100 trillion cells in our body, and there's an internet that lets them talk to each other as well. It's staggering. Information is staggering. It makes information technology look puny. And so people, as we look at life and the way it's programmed, we should be in awe. How would you go about designing the human consciousness or creating musical genius? Or which nucleotides would you have to change to create those things? And so these things go beyond our comprehension. But God did it, and it's wonderful. And we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And more God is showing that through biology, through the highest level of molecular biology. He's revealing that to us. It's an amazing gift from God. The second problem is
Okay, so I'm going to stop the video there, but the bookmarks I gave you guys have that full video, or the name of it is Overwhelming Evidence Proves Apes Are Not Our Ancestors, and it is on YouTube for anyone watching this online. So he has 3 more arguments, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through each of those right now. But one thing, or a couple things I want to just emphasize about the DNA molecule is that it can be compared to a book that can be read forward, backward, in different languages. Parts can be turned on and off based on promoters, different things, different promoters, like say every 3rd nucleotide would be highlighted and used to create the message. It can have overlapping instructions. So depending on where the message is starting, what part of the word, or if it starts at a different point in the word, it's going to have a different meaning. And so, as Dr. Sanford pointed out, it goes beyond our comprehension. It's not something that could have evolved by random mutations. Also, because when you change one area of it, just as he was talking about with a computer program, it's going to mess up several other areas. So there's not a way for like single small mutations to improve a computer program. And this is even more complicated than a computer program. So Dr. Sanford's book, Genetic Entropy, I would highly recommend this. He goes through and explains the mechanisms from a genetic standpoint of why the mechanisms of evolution don't work. But he explains them, I would say, maybe at about a 10th grade level. So he's really good at using analogies and things, language that people without a PhD can understand. And to me, the biggest, his first point about the programming of life being so complex that I guess I'm just kind of reiterating that it's something that could not have evolved by random mutations. So with natural selection, this is something that Darwin did get right. Animals do within a species, within a kind, there's certain ones that maybe bigger ones, smaller ones, certain features, a longer tail or what have you, things that help them to survive better in their own environment. Life does exhibit lots of variation within a kind or a species, and it is programmed with the ability to respond and adapt to different environments. However, what we do not observe is one species turning into another. For example, the lizard into a bird, which is, I believe, with the theory of evolution, the story goes that dinosaurs gradually evolved into birds, and there's just so many things that would have to happen. The birds' bones are hollow, so why would a dinosaur start making hollow bones? It just doesn't make sense of how that would help a dinosaur to survive better, to have hollow bones, but yet not yet be able to fly and things like this. There's just many, many questions that evolution cannot answer. And once again, just quoting God's word says he created each according to their kinds. So I'm going to switch topics here and talk a little bit about dinosaur fossils and how do they fit into Earth history. We're told they're millions of years old, but I want you guys to just think about when you observe, say, roadkill. Okay, we're all familiar with roadkill if you live in Michigan, right? When animals die, what happens? Do they turn into fossils? Are new fossils being made? When animals die naturally or are run over by a car? No. What happens? They're eaten by predators, microscopic organisms. They're going to decay within weeks to months, and they're not going to be there anymore. Same thing when fish die. Are they at the bottom of the ocean gradually getting buried by sediment over, hundreds or millions of years? No, they float and bloat, and again, they're eaten by predators and then decay, and they don't turn into fossils. So what is different about fossils? Why are they formed? Something that I didn't realize is that during the time of Noah's flood, there would have been, it was a whole world restructuring event where there would have been volcanoes and earthquakes and tsunamis taking place all over the earth. And at the time, the mountains were not as high as they currently are today. The mountains were not nearly as high. And then at the end of the flood is when the mountains were pushed up. And that is why we find today is seashell fossils and sea creature fossils at the tops of mountains. This is an example of the volcanoes that were erupting underneath the ocean. And there's also the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which has evidence of volcanoes erupting during this time frame. And so all of that sediment is what would have rapidly buried these animals and covered them and made the fossil record. And so back in 2005 was when Dr. Mary Schweitzer made a discovery of a Tyrannosaurus leg bone. It was basically the equivalent of our femur. And this bone contained some unfossilized tissue, some soft collagen tissue. And she was dumbfounded because of the assumption that the rock layers are millions of years old. And so just a direct quote from her, as you guys can read up here, but it's all of the chemistry, all of our molecular breakdown experiments don't allow for this. But if you consider that it was an event that happened about 4,500 years ago, it actually makes perfect sense. See some of this soft tissue present. Here's another example of a fossil that shows that these have to be buried rapidly so that they turn into fossils before they decay. And this is a fossil who was actually eating lunch when the flood took place. So for more information about Noah's flood and even just scientific evidence for biblical creation, you can visit the Ark Encounter. This is in Williamsville, Kentucky, where they have built an ark according to the dimensions in the Bible. And there's lots and lots of evidence there showing how it was very plausible that they could have had those animals on board for a year. There's also just a wonderful resource here. This is put out by Search for the Truth Ministries. It's an 18-session series on a lot more detail of some of the things I'm talking about with Noah's flood and the rock layers, the geology of our planet, and how it testifies to a young Earth, roughly 6,000 years old, just as stated in the Bible. So my kind of wrap-up statements would just be that observational science, meaning like what we see in the created world around us, agrees with the Bible. And I hope, I know that Jim, you did present something near the end saying that they have made cells, but I guess my statement is not a single cell has ever been made by man, meaning from scratch, if you will. Okay, yes. Okay, so this is an accurate statement. Not a single cell has ever been, man has never been able to make a single cell. And then, there's no real evidence or observations of one species turning into a completely different species. And I've often wondered myself how they explain how egg-laying animals could turn into mammals that give live births, and that whole process. How does that happen one gradual random mutation at a time? As a woman, it just not something that makes sense to me anyway. So we can't completely answer this. No one can go back in, well, no one can go back in time to know exactly what happened at the beginning of creation. But I honestly think if Jesus was here, he would just pick one of these monkey-faced orchids and hand it to you, and that would be his answer that no, but he is a ruler and creator of all earth. So for more information, resources, search for thetruth.net. ICR.org is on creation research, and then the Dinosaur Soft Tissue Research Institute.org is another good resource for you. Just a quick shout out for my recently published book is called Fit by Faith, where I also tell a lot of personal miracles I've had. I've had some health miracles and things like that, and also some stories of miracles with patients that I've treated with healings and things like that. So I really believe the earth is full of the loving kindness of the Lord. And when you look at these things, we can see God's nature and how much he loves us through what he has made. Once again, the King is alive.
We are going to get started again. So the hope for this time, to provide a little bit of guidance, most of the questions are going to be, if you want to ask a question verbally, you can just raise your hand and we'll go kind of in the order that we see them. We do ask that you kind of think about how you want to phrase your question beforehand so that we aren't spending most of the time just asking the question. So think about how you want to phrase it and think about who you want to ask the question to. You can ask a question to all of them, or you can ask a question to one of them specifically. That is up to you. Before I do that, any questions on how to ask questions? And if you at any point come up with a question and you're like, I want to write it down, I don't want to speak it out loud, feel free to come up, get a note card, and you can come hand it to me or Jackson, and then we will read them in between kind of deal. Okay? Any questions? Cool. I have a question to start that somebody handed me. This is to all. Is there any actual scientific evidence that Jesus was resurrected? And if so, what peer review evidence could be looked into? You can go in order. You can go in whatever order you'd like. Yeah. So you can go down the line, or whoever is ready wants to.
Yeah, actually, yeah, I can press that. I'm sorry to. I did not prepare an answer to this question.
Yeah.
So something to understand about science is that it is very good at looking at averages and not as much at like individual events, right? Science is about reproducibility. If something happens once and you can't get it to happen again, like science can't do anything with that. It's just an anomaly. It's about understanding reproducible things. So the resurrection of Jesus, I think we would all agree, is not a reproducible event. Not yet, at least perhaps the end of all time, but at this point, we have not been seeing this. And so science, it's pretty difficult for science to say anything about a one-time historical event, particularly one that happened so long ago. Now, maybe that's too strong of a statement. There's absolutely nothing, but there are real limitations to science, and that's certainly one of them. So that's my response.
I'm going to add into that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was considered a miracle, still is. It's something that doesn't happen as part of the natural order. What a miracle by definition is something that is rare and something that can't be reproduced naturally. So even in my example of the little gap there before the creation of the simplest living organism, that would demand a miracle where something is going in and preventing nature from going in its normal way, changing the direction and making something else happen. Same thing at the resurrection of Christ. When people die, they generally stay dead. In this case, somebody comes back from the dead. That would have to be the supernatural reaching into the natural world to change what happened. So that's not going to be something reproducible or found in a scientific journal at all.
I would just add the comment as well that the Gospels are the account of Jesus being seen in flesh and blood after he was resurrected. And those our historic records.
Right. So there's your evidence. It's not
Yes.
scientific evidence, but it is evidence, right? There are other kinds of evidence.
One thing I forgot to mention, if you want to specifically address one of them, their names are in front of them if you have forgotten it, and that is totally fine. So, another question. Yeah, go for it, Carrie.
What is the purpose of the creationism?
And as you go to answer it, if the first person could just repeat it real quick in the microphone for the recording.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that for all of us? Or is that for one
Yeah.
of us?
Or one person could answer however you want
The answer, the question was, what is the purpose of the creation narrative?
in the gospel.
This is one of those where I want to show a slide. The purpose was for God to tell us how he created us, that it was outside of, it was miraculous event, meaning it's something that obviously not reproducible. And so he told us ahead of time. And again, we don't always think about statements in the Bible as science, but when you look at this very first scripture in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Well, science is the study of time, energy, space, and matter. So right here in this very first sentence, in the beginning, there's your time created. That's the energy. Space is the heaven, and matter is the earth. And he wants us to study his creation. That's why he said, ask the animals, have dominion over the animals. That's in the book of Genesis as well. And to have dominion means to study, understand, and control. So God wants us to study his creation so that we can learn more about his nature. And so I just see the narrative in Genesis as him explaining how he did it originally, and especially with the Christian viewpoint that death entered the world through sin, and sin through one man. And that is the reason that we needed a savior in the first place, Jesus Christ. That's the reason he came, is to pay the price for our sins. So that's just another question that I guess that I would have for the theory of evolution. When you try to mix it with Christianity, it really conflicts with the foundational beliefs of our faith.
So it's a good question, because I think you are going to elicit some different answers. I have a somewhat overlapping. I agree with some of your answer, but also somewhat different.
So my understanding of the purposes of the creation narrative, I don't understand it as much as, a scientific account of how God created. It's very poetic. It's just not how you would write a scientific account. I can go more into that if you're curious. But what I think is about showing us who is the creator, the fact that it was an orderly creation. It's a very structured creation narrative. That was something that was very important to it. So it's about God being in control, God acting in orderly ways. It's about, humanity is the pinnacle of creation. Like, that's something that is emphasized there. And as Cindy was saying, it's very much the fall narrative and our understanding of where sin comes from and our need for a redeemer. I think those are some of the big things that come out of that creation narrative. It's God in control of everything, creating everything. So I do take a somewhat different sense of purpose.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You can say it's a scientific description was anachronistic because people didn't write scientific narratives in the same way we do today in a journal. That makes no sense at all. It was written for a Hebrew audience thousands of years ago. And it's basically there to show that God created everything. And one thing also is that the creation was good. That something that was made, it was a good thing that God did. Once again, going back to that verse in Romans, the creation tells us about God. The creation is good because the creator is also good.
How does Christianity explain the proof of the Gospels and the proof that humans of creation descent to 1%? was the second part of the question? That humans of Eurasian descent have up to 4% Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah, so I just briefly, I would say that these connections, right? Sorry, thank you. I like 2 seconds ago, I was going to repeat the question and then that's all I had. So the question is, how does Christianity explain Neanderthal skulls and that modern humans have approximately 4% on Neanderthal DNA? And I think perhaps slightly more broadly, these, what would I say, the fossil record evidence of different species of the evolution there. So, this is what I would say just briefly is this is part of the evidence for evolution, and that evolution also involves humans, is this fossil record thing. You mentioned Cindy, she had a comment that we would never seen one species evolve into another. Not right before our eyes, no, because it takes a long time, and we haven't been doing this for very long, but that's what the fossil record is. And there are many examples of fossil record of where you can see intermediates where, start like here, and then you have things slightly different, as you go from mammals go back to the ocean, for example. But I don't think this is probably mostly a question for me. So.
Well, I'm going to add that is a reasonable way to understand it. Another way, perhaps understand it, is that my car has 4 rubber tires, has a steering wheel, has a gasoline engine, and a couple seats that I can sit in. The first Model T also had 4 rubber tires, a steering wheel, seats, and a gas engine. It just had not evolved an air conditioner and a radio to listen to at that point. And I'd say similar design would naturally have it use similar parts, similar instructions. That changed over time. Now, cars and living things are not the same. Cars don't give birth to other cars, which is the main difference there. But simply stating that, similar parts or similar structure or similar instructions, it would make sense for a similar designer to use the same stuff more than once, regardless of the intermediate steps.
I was just going to add that we're all descendants of Noah and his 3 sons. And so we're going to have similar genetics. We're actually all cousins in that regard, that all of mankind was killed during the flood, except for Noah, his 3 sons and their wives, and Noah's wife. And so there's going to be some of these genetic similarities between all.
I have a follow-up question about that. So I have a question about human genetics, right? So there's scientific evidence right now that exists that says that the human genetics are so diverse that it wouldn't make sense for them to have originated from 2 or less individuals. There's a variety of information about that out there. And so there are people who are trying to argue how that could work with a creation narrative that focuses explicitly on Adam and Eve. And similarly, where do characters in the biblical narratives come from? For instance, Cain and Abel's wives, Cain, Seth's wives, etc. So how can our genetic code be so diverse if it comes from 2 individuals? And where do the other characters come from? Yeah.
Would you like to answer?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to rephrase the question. It was,
how do you reconcile the diversity of human genetics coming from 2 or from Noah's Ark, from the individuals on the Ark?
How do we reconcile the differences? The diversity. Because the human, God made the genetic code to be very diverse. So it's similar to having, say, like a deck of cards where when they're shuffled together, there's going to be many different versions of how the genetic code is going to show up in the different people groups. But what I've recently read about is that there is something called mitochondrial Eve, where they're able to trace back to one common female about 6,500 years ago. And that fits perfectly with the biblical timeline. And same thing with the Y chromosome, Noah, and that's in quotes, showing that there's a very large difference in the Y chromosome between a 65% difference between a chimpanzee and the Y chromosome. So showing there's a great diversity in that one chromosome, not a whole gene code.
Sure. You said it was called mitochondria E?
Eve, as in Adam and Eve.
Okay.
So I have a couple of books actually on my project where it talks about the pre-Adamite birth. What that refers to is a concept that was actually before Darwin even, that was discussing the possibility of other people living on the earth outside of the Garden of Eden where Adam were. And so things like Book of Genesis, Cain is expelled from the garden and he goes off and gets married. Well, where does this one come from? Some say, well, she was, like I mentioned, daughter of Adam and Eve. But other people have suggested that there were actually people outside the Garden of Eden that were able to, marry and have children with residents therein. So that might possibly explain the diversity that you're talking about as well. That's a theory that's actually existed before genetics, even before Darwin, that there were potentially other people there. Trying to understand that.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to mention, so mitochondrial Eve is a fascinating thing, particularly how it relates to the biblical narrative. But just to correct the date, it's not 6,500 years. I just looked it up and it's estimated 200 to 300,000. So that's about the date of the mitochondrial Eve from their best estimates.
Okay.
Which is, around the time that they did have emergence of modern humans. Also, Erica, as far as so it's true, of course, that if we're all from Noah's sons, then that explains all this relatedness that we have. It should also be noted that our DNA is about 98 to 99% identical with apes. So, the same relatedness argument probably continues. Now, it's possible that there's other explanations. To me, given that, like Jim said, humans do give birth, and we know that's how things pass along, relatedness seems like the simplest explanation for all this similarity. To answer your question, now I'll try to make it really brief, but I am not bothered by those questions because my understanding of those first chapters of Genesis is that they're more like a parable, like the stories that Jesus tells, that they are not intended to be taken historically, like, some of the other parts of the Bible are, right? The Bible is a mixture of figurative and historical parts. And I can go into that more if people are interested, but to me, and the same thing with who did Cain marry or whatever, it's like, if it's a parable, then that sort of question just isn't important. It doesn't have to hang together that way. Now, if it's history, that matters a lot, I think. And you have to struggle with it. And I think that's a small piece of evidence of why it's probably was never meant to be history. But there. Sure.
I can't quote the exact chapter, but it says later that Adam and Eve also had sons and daughters.
Yes.
And back then they did intermarry, obviously, in the genetic code. There weren't as many mistakes built up on our genetic code. And so it wasn't until the time frame of Moses when God wanted us to stop intermarrying so closely because it was there were too many genetic errors building up in our genetic code and would guarantee mutations.
Oh, so many questions.
Yeah.
Our moderators have to decide.
Oh, sorry. Unfortunately, my little guys are here because they love science. So it's been so entertaining. So thank you and engaging for sharing. Also, Ian was horrible at community since COVID. And thank you for loving this audience. You guys put together so well and it's so well done. I'm just so thank you. Thank you for that. I wanted to just ask you, Stephen, if you share the slide showing that relativity of bats and the dorsal fin and the knee and the arm, I think it's arm and all the interconnected relatedness. So my bias have come from a creationist perspective. So, but when you were sharing that, I had this image that we could say, like, you know, this is a Van Gogh painting because we know Van Gogh's style. And interplay between all of Van Gogh's work, you're going to say that has the print of Van Gogh. And that's why he's so adored, because of the style he created. And I'm just curious, could it be possible within the mindset that you're and framework that you are sharing, could it also be possible that in God's creation, the similarities are not necessarily because of evolving from one another, but because the fingerprint of the creator and his design is seen throughout all the variety in which he created. And that, yes, the DNA, because he's the life giver and he put that life source within it, there is commonality and similarity due to that fact of designer. And I just was curious how, I'm sure you've heard that before. I'm sure I'm not saying something you haven't heard. And I have no idea how to re-articulate it in the microphone. But I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. No, it's a fair question. I mean, as I understand it, I'll leave out the Van Gogh and stuff for the sake of brevity, but you know, could there be another explanation for the similarities that we see in life besides relatedness? Could it just be that that's the way God did it because that's the way it did, because that was his fingerprint, I think you were saying, of the design, or just, I think Jim said something about similarities, and I think probably Jim will want to answer this question after I'm guessing. So, you know, at some level, right, God could do it, right? So it's kind of like, I can't say, well, God could have done that or not have done that. I guess the thing is, the patterns of relatedness fit family relations, like a common descent sort of relation, family relations fairly well. And we also know just from biology, like we said, we have children, we pass on DNA. We know that's how things are passed on. So while it's possible that that's not how they're actually related, but God just made it look that way for some other reason, it feels just like a little bit of a strained argument to me. Like, it just seems like a simpler argument to say things are similar because they're related. So again, I can't rule out that as an alternative argument. I would wonder why God had made it so perfectly so it looks like they're related in all these details. And like I said about, you know, the genetics and all these things, you know, I've heard arguments that, you know, it's like complete that way or something, or, you know, but I would wonder, is God trying to fool us? I mean, if he's working so hard to make it look that way, maybe we're meant to believe that it's that way. I don't know. It gets kind of weird. I don't want to speculate too far, but so that's what I'd say. I can't rule that argument out, but it doesn't seem as simple to me as saying it looks like we're all related. We see similarities and we know that the things are perfect. But I look to hear what you know, say about that. I think it's different.
Yes and no. I think they're both correct in some ways, that there are relatedness between different creatures, relatedness between parents and children, and they look alike, but they're a little different, and that's okay. And we can say that yes, heredity preserves design throughout time, even if that's over a long period of time. I guess my argument would be is, well, if we see at least at one example where something had to step in and to start building or creating, do I know that when it comes between the lizard and the bird, like Cindy was showing, that that's just a slow, gradual evolution between one and the other? Or is that a stop and a restart using a similar blueprint in DNA and similar, which will then produce similar looking parts. I think both answers are correct. Yes, there's relationships. That's where the evolution comes in. And yes, there's a fingerprint of the creator where you see things being remade again. Where those lines are, I can't tell you because it's a long period of time over that we can't repeat. One of the problems about origin science versus, say, physics. Like if I want to find out if I can shoot a gun and hit that clock over there and I fire with a certain rate and velocity and I can posit the time and all the variables and I repeat it over and over and over and over again, I know exactly what formula, what weight of bullet, what amount of explosive will it take to get there. That's science with a hypothesis, with a formula, and with a repeatable event. One of the key natures of the scientific method is that it's repeatable. It's impossible to repeat the creation of life as it happens here, or the Earth, or the universe. You can do detective work, which isn't wrong. I'm not saying that that's invalid. You can just try to put the pieces together from the clues that were left behind. That's okay. That's what we're all doing here, actually. But it's a little different than saying, how does life evolve from nothing? You can't repeat that over and over again. And so, was it all just relationships from one single organism today, or was there creation acts along the way? I don't know where to do that, except at the very beginning, because that is a simple starting point.
Somebody wants to go. Do you want to ask your question? Yes. Do you think that miracles necessarily have to be unexplainable, or do you think they can be emergent from that process?
Man, question for all of us, or for whatever?
Yeah, no, that's a fair question. I would say.
Can you repeat?
Yes, so sorry. Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. So bad at that. So the question is, do miracles necessarily have to be unexplainable by natural mechanisms, or could they be emergent from natural mechanisms? Yeah, so I have perhaps a looser take on miracles than some others might, because I think Jim had defined one earlier as being, by my understanding, that it could not be, that it has to be something that.
My answer is that's the definition of a miracle.
And I have a little bit of a looser definition of a miracle. To me, a miracle is something that is like unusual and impressive that God did. And that's a fuzzy definition because again, God does everything, right? So the first most important thing is we don't want some dichotomy like sometimes has been the case in sort of Enlightenment era theism where, the universe kind of runs itself like a clock that God wound up. And every so often he intervenes in a miracle. I don't like that model at all. I think it's much more, God is much more involved than that at every single step. And so in some sense, everything's a miracle, right? And yet also in some sense not. I mean, there are these things that God does that are particularly impressive, that stand out, that are not the way things usually work, like resurrection, for example. I know that's kind of a fuzzy answer. But I would say it kind of depends on how you define a miracle. The way I see it, I can see a miracle either as being a violation of natural laws or very possibly something that, it could happen through natural laws, but would be very unlikely. Could still seem like a miracle or even something that maybe could be explained. So for me, that violation of natural laws part that some people see as part of the definition of miracle doesn't strictly have to be there. And like the important thing to me is to understand that miracles aren't the only way God works. One of them.
I would agree with that it can be both, because it can involve the timing of how and when certain circumstances come together that form a miracle for you personally. Like, boy, I got that call for the job interview and they only had one opening and I was the candidate and it was the only day, whatever the circumstances. Sometimes those can be answers to prayer, the hand of the Holy Spirit. And again, it's a matter of how you define a miracle, but there's nothing wrong with giving God the glory when things like that happen.
I'm just going to clarify that in her example, it's still a supernatural event in the sense that the timing would not have happened unless there was an intervention. So to me, the world works in a certain way. You know, when I drop something, it falls to the ground because God built the laws into the world that happen. If I dropped a book and it flew up to the ceiling, that would be a miracle because that's not what's supposed to happen. But sometimes those miracles will be hidden because they could be explained naturally. I happened to get the job I prayed for. But is that because you did a good job, or is that because there was some intervention that gave you the job when you otherwise would not have?
And I guess, I take a view where, to go off what you were saying, if I think of a miracle, it's that, like the times when God intervenes, then I think every moment is miracle. Because I believe that God is intimately controlling everything. That's my understanding of the nature of reality within the probabilistic range of things. Yeah. Next question.
I'm going to do one of the anonymous questions. I don't know if it's more helpful for you to go up there. It's that we have.
That would be excellent.
Great. I will do that. Is the biblical age of the earth, stating that the earth is 6,000 years old, really in the Bible? And how does that coincide with science? I feel like I should hand that to you first.
So the actual number, to my knowledge, is not stated in the Bible, but when you look at the genealogies from Adam all the way down to Noah and then to Moses, I mean, all the genealogies are there with the number of years that individuals lived and so forth. And it works out to about 6,500 years. So that is history. So history.
My view is that the world is old, meaning billions of years. Looking at it from a biblical point of view, if you're just counting the genealogy, like Cindy said, yes, you can get back to 4,004 BC. I forget the actual date. You can get pretty close to a year. But then that presumes that, that is the only way to count the years. And my thought is that I'm not an expert in geology or astrophysics. I'm not going to necessarily challenge the prevailing view there. That is for other people to get into that field and walk around a little bit if they disagree with the prevailing paradigms. But I think at the same time, even before modern science, there was debate about the age of the earth and the creation order of Genesis even. If you look back at Augustine, he was arguing for something like a long period of time, that the days were metaphorical, weren't actual days. If you look at the Jewish philosopher Philo, he said there wasn't any process at all. God created it all at once. The reason Genesis is broken into days is so our simple minds could actually get it spelled out a little bit better for us. So, the concept of do I read the history, literally word for word, day as day, versus do I read it metaphorically, is not something new to the modern era. Trying to harmonize it in science is something that's been debated for thousands of years.
Yeah, so I largely agree with Jim. It's so bad that the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. I think that's a song.
Let's go to the audience. I will say we are over time. We're going to keep taking questions for a little bit as far as we can. If that's okay with you guys.
Yeah.
They would love to hear more of your questions if we don't get to them all just out in the hallway, because we will have to be out of the room by 9:30. So yes, Seth.
So quick question. Well, not quick.
Is your question to all of them or just one of them?
Whoever wants to answer. So Romans 5. Therefore, it's just through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread all mankind because all sin. I was wondering, natural selection is like the power of death, kind of. Death, reproduction, you pass on genes. I was wondering if, like, the presupposition, at least that Paul was making, is that nothing died until Adam and Eve sinned, then where would that natural selection come from? Or would you think that Paul was making a different argument in the passage?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that. I think that's a great question. So it is true.
Can you restate this?
Yes, I
That
can
question's
actually.
really long.
No, it's fine, actually. So, I mean, we'll look at the passage, but basically the, so the traditional sort of Garden of Eden view, right, is that creation was perfect and like it was fully created perfect. And then it fell and became empty, right? And I understand natural selection does require a different understanding where creation, because yes, natural selection only works in an imperfect universe where there is random variation and even more so where there is competition and death and, violence and those sorts of things. And so if I understand, as I do, natural selection to be a mechanism through which life in its current form and diversity is created, then that the fall can't have come strictly after all of that. And so I guess what I'd say that's my understanding of it. Again, I understand that fall is a very real spiritual reality, but not that again there are literally two humans and then one ate a fruit and then the fall happened. I actually kind of see it as an example of how, as in the story of Joseph, God uses evil, because clearly the brokenness of the world is evil, to bring beautiful and glorious things. This understanding that the way we got this diversity of life was through these somewhat terrible processes of survival of the fittest, is both sort of a terrible thing, but also kind of a beautiful thing of everything that. So that's mostly just an acknowledgement of your question that is a real question. But yeah. Does that sort of answer? At least start to?
I think the other thing is that the other way to look at that is that the death in our world is spiritual death. Because family didn't just fall for die right when that happened, which would be kind of a sort of a straight reading of that. So what kind of death in the garden? Well, now they are no longer in union with God, that their souls are separated, and it's going to be up to God to redeem that, to bring them back into a relationship with God as well. And that is where Paul will actually go, reading Romans there for a while. He's looking at the spiritual life and death more than the physical moral life.
I would just say that I think it goes along with that in the Garden of Eden, there was no death or sin until that original sin, where man, Eve, questioned God's word. That was the tactic that the enemy used. He said, "Did God really tell you not to eat the fruit of that tree?" And so his tactics haven't changed all these years.
This is probably what we're Dr. Steve, I think.
I'll try to repeat it.
And this is a question, depending on your answer, will have some problems. So in your definition of evolution, you talk about relatedness and then natural selection.
Yeah.
The way I look at the relatedness, it doesn't really give a mechanism. And natural selection can only select something that's changed. Do you agree with that?
Can only select something. So natural selection only works if there's variation.
Correct.
You're saying, yes,
And
that is
so
true.
I couldn't find in your definition the
Yeah.
mechanism beyond natural genetic shift that happens over time within species.
Yeah.
Enough mechanism to change a bacteria to a will. What is the mechanism that adds genetic products from 500 genes to that lowest common denominator to a blue whale or a human that has 20,000? And what is the mechanism that not only adds that genetic information, but makes sure it's orderly so that that next gen survives?
Yeah, so these are certainly the questions, and these are good questions that actually evolutionary biologists have to think a lot about, because it is a big map. It is hard. And like I said, scientists disagree a little bit on how hard of a question that is. There are, however, some, I can give at least some partial answers to that. One thing that adds more genetic information is we often have what are called genome duplications, where you basically, through random processes, but it's not a hard thing to happen. When a cell divides, you basically end up occasionally getting a second copy of all your genes. And then if you got the second copy, now you have redundancy, because you only need one copy to still do what it was already doing. And now the other copy can potentially get some mutations and start doing something else. So that's one mechanism that can help to explain that. And I guess my other point actually just was in general about redundancy. So, somebody in the video made a comment about it being a little bit like computer code. And computer code often is written to be, precise, not have a lot of redundancy in it. I've done a little bit of coding, and believe me, it's unforgiving. And life is not like that. The genetic code actually does have quite a bit more flex and quite a bit more redundancy. For example, you might know that, there's 20 different amino acids, but some of them are fairly similar to each other. If you get a mutation that changes you from a leucine to an isoleucine, 99% of the time it's not going to make any difference. Occasionally it will, and usually bad. Occasionally it will, and maybe good. So that there is some redundancy and some not flexibility, but just anyway, can't think of the word, but it's kind of built into the system. Some rigor in there, and I think that could help some to understand that. Now, is it still incredible? Absolutely, and I think both Jim and Cindy really emphasize that, like with the motors and that sort of thing. But there are mechanisms to explain at least some of it. Yes.
So my understanding of gene duplication is it's adding the duplication of the gene. So it's not novel information for novel structures. And also, it seems that mutation rates, the rate of negative mutations far exceeds any benefit of mutation. And so time isn't the hero of the plot. If you multiply mutations, you multiply disorders. And so we have genetic disorders that are exponentially increasing. And it seems that in protein structures, if you get a couple of amino acids wrong, it recycles that back to the ribosomes and you get to start over.
Well, depends on which amino acids and how serious they are.
But there's only a few that have redundancy in the code, right? Not all of them are redundant.
Not all of them are redundant.
The rest of them, if you get it wrong, the protein structure doesn't fold correctly.
Again, it depends, right? But yeah, some mutations, some amino acid substitutions are going to cause the protein to misfold. Some are tolerated. Very few will create something different. But though, so you say time is not the hero, and that is true. Time alone is not. What the hero is the natural selection. The hero is that, yes, 999 times out of 1,000, probably actually more, the mutation is bad. And those all die. And we never see them again.
And they can't reproduce.
And they can't reproduce, we don't see them. And the only ones that we see, the only ones that remain are those extremely rare ones where it was actually a beneficial thing. So that's the argument.
And one last follow-up from that. Yep. In a case like that, it seems like if there is a benefit, let's say a polar bear originated without, or somehow a gene broke and now it doesn't develop the pigment.
Right, and it's a white
camouflage.
Yeah, classic.
That's a gene breaking. It's not any new information. And so if I want a car to go faster, I can remove weight, but it doesn't make the car better. So the trend isn't the friend. I don't see a trend in a mutation natural selection mechanism that adds enough novel beneficial mutation to see a bacterium become a leader. I don't know how much time, because the trend is away from producing something positive in the mutational structure. And I haven't been convinced to see that mutations, because nobody wants to mutate a child. Right. And the doctor deals with mutational disorders all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are examples, and I'm embarrassed that I don't have a good one like on top of my head or a slide or whatever, but certainly there are examples like at the protein level, right, where you can see how proteins have gained new functions. That you can see, oh yeah, this protein is like 80% related to this protein that has a totally different function, but now this one has a new one by changing a few things.
And I would agree that I would say that.
And not in every case do we understand this, but there have been.
And I would agree that there is opportunity for speciation. That's something that we do see, especially in isolated populations. But to bridge the gap between families, between dogs and cats, between birds, is to me, mutations just can't pull it off because they.
I think that's Jim's point too.
So you were quoting one of the 4 arguments that Dr. Sanford spells out in his book. Well, the title, Genetic Entropy, and that's what it is. The genetic code is deteriorating, not improving. And when you look at the enormous amount of new, which is what you said, and useful information or positive changes that will be required to take a bacteria all the way to a human, but time, again, like you said, is not the hero. The waiting time problem, it's not only that single mutations over time could gradually do this. You need words that to be useful information. So it exponentially increases the amount of time that would be needed. It's mathematically impossible. And the other thing is the intention, meaning why would a bacteria, for example, or for some other very low life, start thinking, boy, I wish I had a circulatory system, and start developing a heart. Any of these systems, from a physiology standpoint, in our body, unless they're fully formed and fully functioning, they don't work, and so then they wouldn't continue on. And so you can't explain the complexity of our body. Stepping away from the microscope, looking at the systems, looking at your circulatory, respiratory, all the systems that we have. Evolution cannot explain them gradually developing.
There's a lot loaded in the word evolution. So Dr. Jim talked about COVID and the change. I think we see microbial evolution. I think we do see speciation. It's just there's a gap between that. I would use the word taxonomic families, so closer to the word biblical kind, not species. And you're trying to take the biblical word and make it into a scientific word. That's kind of difficult sometimes. But in the case of COVID, it became less violent. It didn't become more violent.
Well, no. Yeah, I'm gonna argue against that. The COVID actually, the perfect virus is one that infects you, and you don't even know you have.
That makes sense.
You're not sick. You're not lying in bed. You're up walking around. You're doing everything you're doing and breathing it on everybody.
Yeah, it loves you.
So from that point of view, it's better. It's less dangerous for us, but it's a better transmitter of itself.
So did it become weaker, or is that not?
It became less lethal. But as far as a visitor to our planet, it's probably thriving better. But it's still COVID. It didn't become an elephant along the way. And so the question is, with dogs, we talk about breeds. Whether you have a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, other than size complications, they could still technically have babies. They have the same genetic makeup, and they can still procreate and have another dog.
They survive in the wild.
Well, not necessarily, but it's still usually the general definition of a species is something that can breed with itself, within that species, regardless how wildly different it may look. I have a lot of other thoughts on that, but I'm going to pass because I could probably talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, I think we should get another question.
Yeah.
I think I'm actually going to say we probably need the 5 minutes to clean up. However, if you would like to continue these conversations in the hall, and if your questions did not get answered and you didn't get a chance to ask them, the panelists are more than happy to stick around for a little while to talk about these things. So hold on to those questions. The other thing I want to say is we came up with a resource sheet. Each of these panelists helped create it, of resources behind the views that you can do more research with. So as you exit, it is on the chair there, and it has a few resources. If they're a website, they're in blue. If it's a book, it says book next to it, and it has a brief description on it.
I would encourage you to take one. If you had friends who left as well, take a couple extra, take it for them, okay? And then, yes, that is what we'd like to say with that.
And one last announcement. So we want to thank all of our guests. So
Yes.
thank you guys so much for coming.